Hello, everybody. I am Mrs. Poppet, and this is my place. It's so nice to see you all here today. If you're new, welcome, welcome, welcome. And if you're back, it's wonderful to see you again. If you remember, yesterday we started with part 1 of The Little Mermaid. And at this time, the mermaid was just finished watching the prince's birthday celebration when a terrible storm came out. And the ship got hit and split in half, and it was taking on water. Shall we continue? Let's. The little mermaid now perceived that the crew were in danger. Even she herself was obliged to be careful to avoid the beams and planks of the wreck which lay scattered on the water. At one moment it was so pitch dark that she could not see a single object, but a flash of lightning revealed the whole scene. She could see everyone who'd been on board, excepting the prince. When the ship parted, she had seen him sink into the deep waves. And she was glad, for she thought he would now be with her. And then she remembered that human beings could not live in the water, so that when he got down to her father's palace, he would be quite dead. But he must not die. So she swam about among the beams and planks strewn across the surface of the sea, forgetting that they could crush her to pieces. Then she dived deeply under the deep, dark waters, rising and falling with the waves, till at length she managed to reach the young prince, who was fast losing the power of swimming in that stormy sea. His limbs were failing him, his beautiful eyes were closed, and he would have died had it not been the little mermaid had come to his assistance. She held his head above the water, and let the waves drift them where they would. In the morning the storm had ceased, but of the ship not a single fragment could be seen. The sun rose up red and glowing from the water, and its beams brought back the hue of health to the prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his high, smooth forehead and stroked back his wet hair. He seemed to her like the marble statue in her garden, and she kissed him again and wished that he might live. Presently came into sight of land, and she saw lofty blue mountains, on which the white snow crested as if a flock of swans were swimming on them. Near the coast were beautiful green forests, and close by stood a large building. Whether a church or a convent she could not tell. Orange and citron trees grew in the garden, and before the door stood lofty palms. The seas here formed a little bay in which the water was quite still, but very deep, so she swam with the handsome prince to the beach, which was covered with a fine white sand, and there she laid him in the warm sunshine, taking care to raise his head higher than his body. Then the bells sounded in the large white building, and a number of young girls came into the garden. The little mermaid swam out farther from the shore and placed herself between some high rocks that rose out of the water. Then she covered her head and neck with the foam of the sea, so that her little face might not be seen, and watched to see what would become of the poor prince. She did not wait long before she saw a young girl approach the spot where he lay. She seemed frightened at first, but only for a moment, and then fetched a number of people, and the mermaid saw that the prince came to life again, and smiled upon those who stood around him. But to her he sent no smile, for he knew not that she had saved him. This made her very unhappy, and when it was led away into the great building, she dived down sorrowfully into the water and returned to her father's castle. She had always been silent and thoughtful, and now she was more so than ever. Her sisters asked her what she had seen during her first visit to the surface of the water, but she would tell them nothing. Many an evening and morning did she rise to the place where she had left the prince. She saw the fruits in the garden ripen till they were gathered, the snow on top of the mountains melt away, but she never saw the prince, and therefore she returned home, always more sorrowful than before. She was very sad. It was her only comfort to sit in her own little garden and fling her arm around the beautiful marble statue, which was like the prince. But she gave up tending her flowers, and they grew in wild confusion over the paths, twining their long leaves and stems around the branches of trees, so that the whole place became dark and gloomy. At length she could bear it no longer, and told one of her sisters all about it. Then the others heard the secret, and very soon it became known to two mermaids, who were intimate friends, that happened to know the prince was. She had also seen the festival on board the ship, and she told them where the prince came from and where his palace stood. "Come, little sister," said the other princesses as they entwined their arms and rose up the long row to the surface of the water, close by the spot where they knew the prince's palace stood. It was built of bright yellow, shining stone, with long flights of marble steps, one of which reached down to the sea. Splendid gilded cupolas rose over the roof. Between the pillars that surrounded the whole building stood lifelike statues of marble. Through the clear crystal of the lofty windows could be seen noble rooms, with costly silk curtains and hangings of tapestry, while the walls were covered with beautiful paintings, which were a pleasure to look at. In the center of the large saloon, a fountain threw its sparkling jets high up into the glass cupola of the ceiling, through which the sun shone down upon the water and upon the beautiful plants growing around the basin of the fountain. Now that she knew where he lived, she spent many an evening and many a night on the water near the palace. She would swim so much nearer the shore than any of the others ventured to do. Indeed, once she went up the narrow channel under the marble balcony, which threw broad shadow into the water. Here she would sit and watch the young prince, who thought himself quite alone on these bright moonlit nights. She saw him many times of an evening sailing in a pleasant boat, with music playing and flags waving. She peeped out from among the green rushes as if the wind caught her long silvery white veil. Those who saw it believed it to be a swan spreading out his wings. On many nights, when the fishermen with their torches were out at sea, she heard them relate so many good things about the doings of the young prince, that she was glad she had saved his life when he'd been tossed about half dead in the waves, and she remembered that his head had rested on her bosom, and how heartily she had kissed him. But he knew nothing of this, and could not even dream of her. She grew more and more fond of human beings, and wished more and more to be able to wander around with those in that world that seemed so much larger than her own. They could fly over the sea in ships, and mount the high seas which were far above the clouds, and the lands they possessed, their woods, their fields, stretched far beyond the reaches of her sight. There was so much she wished to know, and her sisters were unable to answer her questions. She then approached her old grandmother, who knew all about the upper world, which she very rightly called the lands above the sea. "If humans are not drowned," asked the little mermaid, "can they live forever? Do they die as we do here in the sea?" "Yes," replied the old lady, "they must also die. Their term of life is even shorter than ours. We sometimes live to be 300 years old. But when we cease to exist here, we only become the foam on the surface of the water. And we have not even a grave down here of those we love. We have not immortal souls. We shall never live again. But, like the green seaweed, once it's been cut off, we can never flourish more. Human beings, on the contrary, have a soul which lives forever, lives after the body has been turned to dust. It rises up through the clear, pure air beyond the glittering stars. As we rise out of the water and behold all the land of the earth, so do they rise to unknown and glorious regions which we shall never see." "Why have we not an immortal soul?" asked the little mermaid mournfully. "I would gladly give all the hundreds of years I have to live, to be a human being for only one day, and to have the hope of knowing the happiness of that glorious world above the seas." "You must not think of that," said the old woman.
We feel ourselves to be much happier and much better off than the human beings."
"So I shall die," said the little mermaid, "and as the foam of the sea I shall be driven about, never again to hear the music of the waves, or see the pretty flowers, nor the red sun. Is there anything I can do to win an immortal soul?"
"No," said the old woman, "unless a man were to love you so much that you were more important to him than his father or mother, and if all his thoughts and all his love were fixed upon you. Then the priest placed his right hand in yours, and he promised to be truly you, and here in the ever after. Then his soul would glide into your body, and you would obtain a share in the future happiness of mankind. He would give a soul to you and retain his own as well, but this can never happen. With your fish tail, which we consider to be quite beautiful, is thought on earth to be quite ugly. They do not know any better, and they think it's necessary to have two stout props, which they call legs, in order to be handsome."
Then the little mermaid sighed and looked sorrowfully at her fish tail.
"Let us be happy," said the old lady, "and dart and spring about during the 300 years we have to live, which is really quite long enough. After that we can rest ourselves all the better. This evening we're going to have a court ball."
It was one of those splendid sights which we can never see on earth. The walls and ceilings of the large ballroom were thick with transparent crystal. Many hundreds of colossal shells, some of deep red, others of sea green, stood on each side in rows, with beautiful fire in them, and it was blue, which lighted up the whole saloon and shone through the walls so that the sea was also illuminated. Innumerable fishes, great and small, swam past the crystal walls, and on some of them the scales glowed with a purple brilliancy, and on others they shone like silver and gold. Through the narrow halls flowed a broad stream, and in it danced the mermen and mermaids to the music of their own sweet singing. No one on earth has such a lovely voice as theirs. The little mermaid sang more sweetly than all of them. The whole court applauded her with hands and tails, and for a moment her heart felt quite gay, for she knew she had the loveliest voice of any on earth or in the sea. But she soon thought again of the world above her, for she could not forget the charming prince, nor her sorrow that she didn't have an immortal soul like his. Therefore she crept silently out of her father's palace, and while everything inside was gladness and song, she sat in her own little garden, sorrowful and alone. Then she heard a bugle sounding through the water, and thought, "He is certainly sailing above, he on whom my wishes depend, and in whose hands I should like to place the happiness of my life. I will risk everything for him, and to win an immortal soul while my sisters are dancing in my father's palace. I will go to the sea witch, of whom I have always been so much afraid, but she can give me counsel and help." Then the little mermaid went out from her garden and took the road to the foaming whirlpools behind which the sorceress lived. She had never been that way before. Neither flowers nor grass grew there. Nothing but bare, gray, sandy ground stretched out to the whirlpool, where the water, like a foaming mill-wheel, swirled everything that it seized and cast into the fathomless deep. Through the midst of these crushing whirlpools the little mermaid was obliged to pass, to reach the dominions of the sea witch, and also for a long distance the only road lay quite across a quantity of swarming, warm, bubbling mire, called by the witch her turf moor. Beyond this stood her house, in the center of a strange forest, in which all the trees and flowers were polypi, half animal and half plants, and they looked like serpents with 100 heads growing out of the ground. The branches were long, slimy arms, with fingers like flexible worms. The branches They were moving limb by limb from the root to the top, and all that could be reached in the sea they seized upon and held fast, so that it never escaped their clutches. The little mermaid was so alarmed at what she saw, she stood still, and her heart beat with fear, and she was very nearly turning back, but the thought of the prince and the human soul for which she longed, and her courage returned. She fastened her long flowing hair around her head, so that the Poppet might not seize hold of it. She laid her hands together across her bosom, then she darted forward, as a fish shoots through the water between the supple arms and the fingers of the ugly Poppet, which were stretched out on each side of her. She saw that each held in its grasp something it had seized with its numerous little arms, as if they were iron bands. The white skeletons of human beings who had perished at sea had sunk down in the deep waters. Skeletons of land animals, oars, rudders, chests of ships were lying tightly grasped in their clinging arms. Even a little mermaid who they had caught and strangled. And this seemed the most shocking of all to the little princess. She now came to a space of marshy ground in the wood, where large fat water snakes were roiling in the mire and showing their ugly drab-colored bodies. In the midst of this spot stood a house, built with bones of shipwrecked human beings. There sat the sea witch, allowing a toad to eat from her mouth, just as people sometimes feed a canary with a piece of sugar. She called the ugly water snakes her little chickens, and allowed them to crawl all over her bosom.
I know what you want, said the sea witch. It is very stupid of you, but you shall have your way, and it will bring you sorrow, my pretty princess. You want to get rid of your fish's tail and have two supports instead of it, like human beings on earth, so that the young prince may fall in love with you, that you may have an immortal soul. And the witch laughed, ha ha ha,
so loud and disgustingly that the toad and the snakes fell to the ground and lay there wriggling about.
You are but just in time, said the witch, for after sunrise tomorrow I should not be able to help you till the end of another year. I will prepare a draft for you, with which you will swim to land tomorrow before sunrise and sit down on the shore and drink it. Your tail will then disappear and shrink up into what mankind calls legs. You will feel great pain, as if a sword were passing through you. But all who see you will say that you are the prettiest little human being they ever saw. You will still have the floating gracefulness of movement, and no dancer will ever tread so lightly, but at every step you take you will feel as if you are treading on sharp knives, and the blood must flow. If you will bear all this, I will help you.
Yes, I will, said the little mermaid in a trembling voice. She thought of the prince and the immortal soul.
But think again, said the witch, for once your shape has become like human, you can no more be a mermaid. You will never return through the water to your sisters or your father's palace again. And if you do not win the love of the prince, so that he is willing to forget his father and mother for your sake and love you with his whole soul, and allow the priest to join your hands, then you may be man and wife, then you will never have an immortal soul. The first morning after he marries another, your heart will break, and you will become foam on the crest of the waves.
I will do it, said the little mermaid, and she became pale as death.
But I must also be paid, said the witch, and it's not a trifle that I ask. You have the sweetest voice of any who dwell here in the depths of the sea, and you believe that you will be able to charm the prince with it. But this voice you must give to me, the best thing you possess, for I will have for the price of my draft. My own blood must be mixed in with it, and that may be as sharp as a two-edged sword."
"But if you take away my voice," said the little mermaid, "what is left for me?"
"Your beautiful form, your graceful walk, your expressive eyes. Surely with these you can enchant a man's heart. Well, have you lost your courage? Put out your little tongue that I may cut it off as my payment, and then you shall have the powerful draught."
"It shall be," said the little mermaid. Then the witch placed her cauldron on the fire and prepared the magic draught.
"Cleanliness is a good thing,"
said she, scouring the vessel with snakes which had been tied together in a large knot. Then she pricked herself in the breast and let black blood drop into it. The steam that rose formed itself in such horrible shapes that no one could look at them without fear. Every moment the witch threw something else into the vessel, and when it began to boil, the sound was like the weeping of a crocodile. When at last the magic draught was ready, it looked like the clearest water.
"There it is for you,"
said the witch. Then she cut off the mermaid's tongue. So she became dumb, and she would never speak or sing again.
"If the polypi should seize hold of you as you return through the wood," said the witch, "throw over them a few drops of this potion, and their fingers will be torn into 1,000 pieces."
But the little mermaid had no occasion to do this, for the polypi sprang back in terror when they caught sight of the glittering draught, which shone in her hand like a twinkling star. So she passed quickly through the woods and the marsh, and between the rushing whirlpools. She saw their father's palace, and the torches in the ballroom were extinguished, and all within were asleep. But she did not venture to go into them, for now she was dumb and going to leave them forever. She felt as if her heart would break. She stole into the garden, took a flower from the flower beds of each of her sisters, kissed her hand 1,000 times towards the palace, and then rose up. Through the dark blue waters the sun had not yet risen when she came in sight of the prince's palace, and approached the beautiful marble steps. But the moon shone clear and bright. Then the little mermaid drank the magic draught, and it seemed as if a two-edged sword went through her delicate body, and she fell into a swoon and lay like one dead. That's the end of part 2. Wow! Can you believe she did all of that? She saved the prince, and then she went and saw that wicked little sea witch and managed to survive everything she had waiting for her and got the draft, and she gave up her tail, and now she's going to be human in part 3. Well, it's still exciting, and I know I can't wait to hear part 3 and the conclusion of this story, and I hope you're excited too. Anyway, I really enjoyed today's story time, and I'll see you tomorrow for part 3.